Hey y'all, Dixie here. Last year I tested out the Tarptent Stratospire Lithium and I never gave a full review on it, so today that's what I want to do. The Stratospire Lithium is a two-person double-walled tent. The inner wall is mesh, the outer wall is Dyneema, and the bathtub floor is also made out of Dyneema, although it's a little bit heavier weight Dyneema, so no extra ground cloth is needed. And it even held up well with doggy paws. I'm a big fan of Dyneema, and pretty much ever since I tried my first Dyneema tent on the Pacific Crest Trail, I really haven't gone back except maybe to test out some budget gear and maybe one other tent, but for the most part my go-to is a tent made out of Dyneema. And that's because in storms the strength of Dyneema is second to none. I met a couple during my thru hike of the Appalachian Trail that was camped out up on a windy bald and their nylon tent ended up shredded. Although I don't see that happening all the time, that's always stuck in my mind. So once I found a tent made out of literally the strongest fabric in the world, I just haven't really gone back. It also doesn't sag or hold water after it's been rained on like nylon, for example, and it's a very lightweight fabric. And just as a side note, all of Tarptent's Lithium series tents come already seam sealed, so if you get this tent, that's something that you won't have to worry about. The Stratospire Lithium sets up using two trekking poles, but if for some reason you don't carry trekking poles, Tarptent does have vertical rods that are lightweight that are made to go with their tent, so you could purchase those instead of using trekking poles. There is a door and vestibule on either side of the tent, which is a must for me in a two-person backpacking tent. Sure, it's convenient if you have a partner with you, you're not having to climb over them when you enter and exit the tent, but also I think about, what if I wake up and there's a rattlesnake coiled up in my vestibule and I only have one? So it's always good to have options. I also like that the Stratospire Lithium has these magnetic clasps for when you want to pin the doors open, so you're not having to fuss with bungees or hooks or anything like that. Something else the Stratospire Lithium has that I've never seen in another tent, or at least I've never had another tent that has them, is the pitch lock corners. I call them the struts. It's an upside down V shape on the tent that is designed to help make the pitch more taut. And I think they help with giving a little bit more head and foot space when you're lying down, more vertical space, because it kind of pulls the wall back so you don't have it draping on your forehead. Also, the mesh inner is adjustable, so you can tighten it down or loosen it up to allow it to fit perfectly for whatever campsite you're in. I didn't have to mess with mine a lot, but I guess having the option is a good thing. Another feature I really appreciated was the pockets on the inside of the tent. Most tents have a little storage pocket that you can put your cell phone or headlamp, etc. But I've seen them where they are kind of attached to the floor, so they flop out in the way and you have to worry about not kneeling on your phone and your other stuff and breaking it when you're getting in and out of the tent. But these pockets are just part of that mesh wall, so they don't get in your way. This tent is rated for 3-season backpacking, which means that you would go in the spring, summer, and fall. But if you wanted to take it backpacking on into the winter months, then they do have a solid inner wall option, so it adds a little bit more warmth and helps trap your body heat. But of course, that option is going to be a little more expensive. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of the Stratospire Lithium, at least from my perspective. One of the things that I did notice and appreciate about it is that the mesh inner definitely kept any condensation issues at bay. You know, all of the condensation collected on the outer wall and just ran down the walls, and I never had any issues with dampness on the footbox area of my quilt. Another thing that in theory I like about the Stratospire Lithium is that you can set up the mesh inner separate from the fly. So if you're like me and you like to be able to see the stars while you're lying in your tent but not be eaten by mosquitoes, then this option might really appeal to you. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as, oh, I think I want to look at the stars and I already have my whole tent set up. So I'm just going to unhook the fly and look at the stars. And if I fall asleep, no big deal. If it starts sprinkling, because I can just throw the fly back on. I even tried to make it a little bit easier by just maneuvering the trekking pole into the hook of the mesh. But then I'd still have to remove the guy line from the outside of the tent and hook it to the mesh body and then stake it out. Or I guess you could have just a separate guy line on the mesh in case you wanted to just quickly move the trekking pole over. But even still, you've got to unhook it from the struts. And so it just wasn't as simple as a lot of double walled tents where you can just kind of remove the fly and throw it back on whenever you want. I really love that when I get in and out of this tent, the way that it's designed, the trekking pole isn't right in my way. I mean, the mesh doors only open up about halfway on the side of the tent, where other tents that I've used, it's like a whole rainbow zipper. But still, it's in a nice spot. There's enough room to get in and out of the mesh and not knocking it down while I'm trying to enter or exit. And finally, I noticed on Tarptent's website that they've got a sidecar option for dogs or children if you wanted to build on to the tent that you have. And I just thought that that was really cool and unique. Now let's talk about the things that I didn't necessarily love, but might not be a deal breaker for y'all. When I read the instructions on this tent, they said after a few times it'd take me 2 minutes.
Right.
I guess I'm a below average learner. First, the setup of the tent is a little bit fussy in my opinion. I did get better at it, and I had a process going where the zipper area, I would stake that out first and then move to the stakeout point that's just to the left of that, so the one that does not have the strut, and then put in the trekking pole, stake the guy line out that comes from the trekking pole, move to the other side and do the same thing, and then finally stake the strut corners. But I still find myself having to readjust and move stakes, and this is even after I'm a little bit more practiced than I was before. I feel like on a 2,000 plus mile hike, you would definitely have it dialed in by the end of that, but still, normally after a few times of setting up a tent, I have to fuss with it less than I do this one. Another thing about the setup of this tent is you have to pay attention to which end is the head end and which end is the part where your feet go. And in other tents that I have, like my Z-Pax Duplex, it's all symmetrical, so I just throw it down, stake it out, and I can get in there and feel, oh, actually this side's a little bit higher, so I'll put my head here. But because the mesh doors only open up on half of that wall, to me it's easier if my head is on the opening side. Otherwise, if I'm flipped around, then it's just more awkward to reach out and grab things, and you've got to sit all the way up to unzip the tent, which I know it sounds like not huge issues, but if this is something you're doing day in and day out and it's repetitive, it's just nice to go to camp and have less to think about than more to think about. If you purchase this tent, included with it are 6 aluminum stakes, but really you need 8 at least if you want to be able to open both parts of the vestibule, because one of the stakeout points is the actual vestibule itself. So if you pull the loop off of that stake to roll it up, your tent will collapse. So they do have guy lines that come with the tent so that you can stake it out. That way, if you do unhook that door, you don't lose tension and your tent collapses. This tent also takes a little more effort when packing up. I like to have a tent, like every other tent that I've had, that I can just stuff in my stuff sack and move on down the trail. But because this one has the struts, you've got to be a little bit more careful if you're gonna stuff the tent. You could remove your struts each morning when you pack up and then put them back in place when you set up at night, but I just don't want to have to fool with extra stuff. And Tarptent actually says they recommend not stuffing the tent and instead folding or rolling, I guess that probably would make things easier, but like I said, it's personal preference and I just like one that I can stuff. But the reason they give for not stuffing is to prolong the life of the material. But I've always heard if you fold something in the same place over and over, so if you're going to fold it a certain way and then roll it, that actually wears out the same spot faster. So I don't know what to believe anymore. Also, having the rigid struts can make it a little bit more difficult to store the tent in your pack if you're somebody that likes to have your shelter inside your pack. Because of all of the camera equipment I have, I typically put my tent on the outside anyway. I really love it when a pack has the loops on the bottom that I can slide the tent and stuff sack into and just cinch down. But unfortunately, the pack I was using at the time I had, this tent didn't have those loops, so I just cinched it down on the top of my pack with the closure strap. But for those of y'all who do like to store your shelters inside your pack, this is something to consider. I guess if you had cup holders big enough on the side where you could shove this tent on the side, you could do that and then offset the weight on the other side with water bottles or whatever else. But again, I usually have tripods and other things on the side that I would put the tent in. And one more complaint about the struts. I had a night on the Pinhoti Trail where a tornado was coming through in the area, not right there where I was at, not immediately over me. But it stormed like crazy and the wind was whipping. And unfortunately, to top it all off, I was on some rather rocky-ish ground, so it was hard to drive a stake in. Some of my stakes went in okay, but on one of the strut corners in particular, I just couldn't get the stake to go in all the way. And so the wind would whip and it would snatch the stake out. Well, normally in that situation, I would just take the stake, turn it parallel with the ground, lay it on the ground, and then take a big old rock and set on top of the stake, and it would hold it pretty well. I've done that plenty of times in the past. I've even set up directly on a flat rock and solved the problem doing this exact method. But because the strut is sitting in such a way where it kind of blocks the loop where you would put the stake to turn it sideways, I couldn't stack a rock against that strut and it stay down on the stake. Somebody suggested at the time that I complained about this that I could have put a branch in the strut and then sat a rock on either side, and I suppose that might do the trick. But what I decided for myself going forward with this tent is to attach just a piece of cord on each of the sides that has a strut. That way I can just pull the cord tight and lay the stake sideways if I have to and stack a rock, or put the stake in as far as it would go and stack a rock. And also having that extra cordage might put my stake in an area where I could actually stake it down. Anyway, I hope all of that makes sense, but that is something to think about if you're going to use this tent. So while I appreciated having a little bit extra head space and foot space in the tent with the struts, they just were, in my opinion, more fussy than they were worth. All right, so overall, what are my thoughts? I think that the Tarptent Stratospire Lithium is a solid tent. It's well made and it served me just fine on the Pinhoti Trail. But the main reason I purchased the Stratospire Lithium was because I was considering taking it with me on my thru hike of the TA in New Zealand. But then COVID happened and kind of wrecked all of those plans. But knowing that I was going to be on an island in more moisture, it made sense to test something out to see how it would do with condensation and whether I thought it would be worth the 6 or 7 ounces in comparison to my Z-Packs Duplex. But honestly, if I was going to start the TA tomorrow, I would take my Z-Packs Duplex. I just don't think for the added 6 or 7 ounces, even though it does help with the condensation issue for sure, but it just wouldn't be worth it to me if I've got to fuss with the setup more, pay attention to where I'm putting the head of the tent, and then also take more time packing it up. Not to mention that I'm now using a synthetic quilt, so I'm not quite as worried about condensation as I was with a down quilt, but that synthetic quilt weighs more than my down quilt, so I've already got more weight in my pack. But those are my personal considerations. Again, these might not be deal breakers for y'all, so you really have to think about what your needs are and if this tent would fit them well or not. Well, all right, y'all, that is all I have for you today. If you've got any questions about the Tarptent Stratospire Lithium, feel free to leave those in the comments below. And if you've used this tent, I would love to hear about your personal experiences, because gear is not a one-size-fits-all thing, and your take could help somebody that's trying to figure out if this is the right tent for them. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you go, and we will see y'all next time.